So let me ask about the churches then. I know that you're a man of faith, and I'm assuming from what you've told me that your wife, whether she's following her faith right now, I don't know whether she's practicing her faith, but at least she has at least one time had a commitment to her faith.
Yeah. In the divorce master hearing, I asked her that flat out. I said, "Do you believe in Jesus Christ?" And she said, "Yes, she does." And
She's still going to church at all, or?
To my knowledge, when we speak with our children at 8 p.m. every night of whoever is the non-custodial parent at that time,
Mm-hmm.
and on Sundays when they're in her custody currently, when I ask them about their day, they have not gone to church.
Mm-hmm.
So presumably, the answer to your question is no, she's not going to church because
It would appear that way.
Would appear.
Yeah. We don't know for sure. But I guess the question I wanted to ask you was that what does the church think about the whole thing? I mean, I'm assuming, and maybe I'm wrong here, I'm assuming that maybe you've talked with the pastor. What are their thoughts about the whole thing?
They, like most of the population, don't want to get involved.
Right.
It's unfortunate. It's 50% of all marriages today. The statistic is end in divorce.
Right.
And every subsequent marriage, that statistic grows even higher.
Yeah.
So this is a huge public issue that gets swept under the carpet and nobody wants to talk about.
Yeah.
And the church is the same way. They don't want to be involved. They say that they can recommend a counselor.
Right.
That's really, and to that extent but then the parties need to agree to that.
Yeah.
And so far, my wife and I have actually never had any marriage counseling.
Yeah.
She wanted that initially, and at the time I didn't realize what was going on and everything, and I didn't want to do that.
Yeah.
For a number of reasons, but I've realized that I was wrong in that, and I needed to put the marriage first, and I needed I need to do the things that
So
I need to do.
I talked with Mike McManus out of Maryland a couple of days ago. He has this program, which started with his wife, called Marriage Savers. And what he was doing instead of counseling, he actually doesn't even recommend counseling. Mm-hmm. Because again, like counselors, like divorce attorneys, they get paid by how long you can be there.
Well, and then they, I think that people develop a codependency on counseling.
They do,
In fact, like I had mentioned, my wife now, who's been going through counseling and all, is demanding that our children be in counseling. It's and that's not, our children need a loving, committed family relationship, husband and wife role model for them, and the appropriate discipline between the two of us. Yeah. And without that, they're gonna have issues. But and that's unfortunately that's what's going unrecognized is that is truly what what is needed for the family, for the children. Yeah. And now there should be national counseling for the children too, right?
So what Mike McManus was saying is that many times churches have no clue what to do because they're not taught it. Pastors are not taught in seminary. I think Mike was being very gracious to talking about the situation. He did point out something critical. Seminaries are not preparing people. If seminary is the route to go, because I don't think that seminary has to be the route to go. But churches, what Mike has done throughout the country, he has worked with numerous churches in numerous cities in which they develop a program of marriage mentors. And it's not a counseling situation. It's a mentorship, a marriage couple mentorship program. And what they've seen is the divorce rate has plummeted. Mm-hmm. So he was telling me about Modesto, California, the divorce rate, and he did it with the churches. He got the churches together to do this. Here are the benefits. The benefits were that to the entire city, the divorce rate plummeted by more than 50%. Mm-hmm. El Paso, Texas, he said that was the greatest success. The divorce rates plummeted by 76%, and For 4 years in a row, El Paso, Texas had the lowest crime rate in the United States. Is there a relationship between reduced crime and families staying together? Of course there is. Austin, Texas, another place that the divorce rate decreased by 50%. And he said Austin was ranked like number fourth lowest in crime. You look at a lot of these places where you have high crime rates, you also have high divorce rates or high rates of families never being formed because people go in, they no longer get married for a number of reasons. One of them maybe because they're afraid to get married. They're still having sex and they're still having kids, but the kids are still growing up without a father and a mother committed together.
I recently saw a statistic where children at age 12, if the parents are married, as opposed to parents that are not married, there's a 70% difference in the children that parents that are together by age 12, if married versus unmarried couples. So certainly there's a benefit to the marriage and to the children.
And there's the book written by Elizabeth I think her name is Elizabeth Marquette. I don't know how you say her last name, but she took a study of relatively successful people, and by relatively successful, she meant people that had graduated from college. She used that as the measure of success, and I think maybe we're doing something in the professional life. I'm not sure exactly what that part, but basically that they had graduated through college, from intact family, from non-intact families. And even though both of them may have been very outwardly successful, there was a huge difference between those who had the intact family versus those who did not come from the intact family. Layla Miller, Catholic author, wrote the book Primal Loss, The Now Adult Children of Divorce Speak Out. Because usually what happens is children are told, you just have to, this is for your good. Your parents are happy, so you should be happy. They're being forced into silence. And yet after 25, 30 years of the suffering, now you're getting adults that are saying, wait a minute, it's time for us to speak out. Here's what happened to my life. And now not in every instance does life get derailed or anything like that. But in so many instances this happens that it becomes almost abusive in the sense of the child. It disrupts their childhood. People that talked about how they walked away from their faith. They said, how could God let this happen to my family? And the churches say nothing.
Yeah.
And the children say, why did the church do anything? They let it go.
Yeah, one of our pastors, I actually went to our pastor and I asked him to meet with us.
Yeah.
And he told me that counseling is not his spiritual gift, and he refused to do it. He actually was more concerned about a lawsuit being brought against him and the church if one party or the other disagreed with something, than actually doing what I believe the church's responsibility is to do.
It is a responsibility.
You're supposed to bring before the other person. What is Matthew 18? You bring before the other person, your grievance, and then if not success there with another person, and go before the church. Right. And the church isn't willing to do that.
And even in 1 Corinthians, it says that that you should not even go to a court of unbelievers. Yeah. If you have an issue, take it to the church.
Yes.
And the church is afraid to do that. That's another area that the church is completely abrogating its responsibility. But if you look at Scripture from the book of Genesis, when God created Adam and Eve, and the two shall become one, they will be one flesh, what God has joined together, let no man take apart. Jesus reiterates this in Matthew 19. Absolutely. And the church is afraid to talk about it. Now the church will talk about same-sex marriage, but here's another issue. And I've talked with Dr. Stephen Baskerville about this. He said, what the church does not understand is that what's happening with the gay, the lesbian community, they're saying, hey, you guys don't believe in marriage, and the proof is you aren't staying married. You may believe in serial polygamy versus simultaneous polygamy, but you're married, divorced, married, divorced, married, divorced. And many of your marriages are temporary. You're very hypocritical about this. If you're going to destroy marriage, we want our share of it, for the government benefits, for the tax benefits, or whatever. Now, if you want to go back and say that this needs to be a lifelong commitment, we'll back off. But we're taking the model that you gave us, and we're saying, if it's good for you, why isn't it good for us? And a lot of the people that are actually embracing some of these things are also children of divorce as well.
Yeah.
So, But it's a shame that the churches aren't speaking out.
Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate. I mean,
Yeah.
if you look at what just happened in the United Methodist Church,
Yeah.
and the tension in that, where it, potentially could
Yeah.
split to two different churches
Yeah.
just based on those matters.
Yeah. Now I go to a church in Dallas. It's called Watermark, and they have a class down there that it's re-engaged, and they've actually taken. And I don't know if Mike McManus had any impact in this or not, but the same thing. They have couples that are there. They're couple mentors, and they have classes for the premarital thing. Sometimes people don't get married after as the result of doing this, which is good because they're not getting divorced then, with kids involved. But they have taken marriages that have been, a lot of things have happened, but they have couples that have said, we've worked through situations of adultery in our own lives, or this or that. We can work it through.
Yeah.
And they take the approach that the marriage is before God. You've made a commitment to God. Your number one commitment was the vow to God. And if there are situations where marriages are falling apart, all hands on deck. We need to help these people reconcile. Sometimes you have to separate them because of safety issues.
Yeah, and that's, it doesn't say in Scripture that, you remain physically together. You separate for a period of time and pray about it, and then come back together.
Yeah.
And that's where I think the church is, if they were stepping up. The one thing that I like, if you're familiar with Dr. Tony Evans, he talks
he's
about...
He's down in Dallas too,
Yeah.
Oak Cliff.
Yeah, Oak Cliff. So he talks about in their church, they actually have a program that they bring, if there's a couple that wants to get a divorce, they bring them in before a Christian court. And
I didn't know that.
they actually have a
Yeah.
lawyer. They have lawyers there and everything that are there, and they make a decision from the church whether a divorce should actually be granted or not. And they'll give you a bill of divorcement if they determine that you should get a divorce.
That's very interesting.
And then you take that to a secular court.
Yeah.
And get that divorce then.
Yeah.
But that type of program, if a church would take that kind of action and determine, if you should divorce or not.
It's a much more biblical approach.
Yeah. And then the church is making that decision.
Yeah. And so the re-engage program that I was telling you about from Watermark, they've got couples that have on the brink of divorce and they stay together. They've got couples that have been divorced and they get remarried. There's another guy that I talked with about 15, 16 months ago, and same thing. He's working on it. I think he's got his PhD right now. But he was saying, Jeff, the whole thing with marriage mentors. He said we're seeing people that are like they're going to file for divorce, and I think he told me it was 75% of those couples are staying together, because a lot of times there's ways to help these couples, but not if you're a chicken church.
No. And that's been our problem. We've actually gone through, because of some other things that have happened in our church, we've been through several pastors in the last 2 years. Yeah. And they're all just trying to clean up the rest of the stuff in the church, and nobody's interested in actually stepping up and helping us. I still believe that in our case that I'm still trusting that God will honor our marriage and that that things will work out despite how terrible it looks right now. But that's, I think that the church is, I actually met with our bishop, and she told me that our church has failed us, and they haven't done what our book of discipline says that should happen. So that's where she said, there's not excuses for it, but she takes responsibility for the church. Yeah. So that's why I appreciated that, but that doesn't help.
It doesn't help. Well, now that you've acknowledged that, step up.
Yeah.
I've seen.
She offered to testify in a court that the church has failed, but that doesn't help to provide us the counseling that we've never had or
the help
like that.
Yeah, and I've known of instances, and I will say this because of my own former in-laws, that I don't know what I should or shouldn't say, but my former father-in-law married us. Did not agree with the divorce. Everybody was against it. They were all upset with their daughter or sister, and and yet they facilitated the divorce. And all I just said is, you go and apologize to my, there was money that was involved. It was a way for them to come and look at themselves as being heroes, but they were also financially profiting from it. And I was shocked. And I demanded that they apologize to their grandchildren, to my children, and they wouldn't do so. And for about a year and a half, I asked them to do so. They didn't. And it was about a year and a half. So eventually I wrote to their church. They were missionaries in Mexico. And I actually had supported them financially at one time, but their church kind of ignored me. And then finally, after almost 2 years, there was a pastor there that I called him up. And I said, I've been writing to you guys. Are you going to do anything? Well, he wasn't even seeing the letters. I guess somebody else had seen them, but he hadn't. So then when he came back up, they talked to him about it, and evidently, and my ex-wife, who committed perjury in court, I mean, I've got the transcripts and everything, writes a letter on their behalf. And of course, it is amazing the stuff that is said. And so they have determined that Rich and Yvonne Lee, there's no fault with them whatsoever. And this case has now been closed. So I heard my former father-in-law preach online, transcribed it, and I thought, you hypocrite. Because he's talking about a church in Mexico. We cannot have division in the church. A couple of people are grumbling. I transcribed the sermon. I mentioned the stuff that he did, and because I had supported them, I actually had a lot of emails. Whether you agree with this approach or not, this is what I did. But I blasted it. It went to about 100 people. And it caused a little bit of crisis in the church. But you know what? If you don't want your name on the front page of the Washington Post, don't do the things that put your name on the front page of the Washington Post. You know, all they had to do was say to my kids, I'm sorry, we were wrong. But they are missionaries. And then I found out, I even wrote to the organization that supposedly had ordained him, which he was ordained for a time, and I asked them to remove his ordination. At which point they said, well, when he left our organization, he was no longer ordained with us. So I think he's been carrying around false ordination credentials. Because I called the other organization afterwards, and they said, well, we don't ordain people. So, I mean, there's a whole lot of crooked stuff that takes place, but then the church too often justifies or has been influenced by culture and justifies her lack of action. And there's so many marriages that could be saved, that should be saved. So many families that should not be destroyed.
Absolutely.
So